I started off as a nutrition scientist.
Speaking on sports nutrition.
There's so many different supplements, right? The market is huge.
Or is it also useful for like endurance running or?
Also helps with glycogen storage in our muscles.
We're seeing a benefit.
Because timing matters with creatine. You want to take it.
And some of these caffeine levels are really scary.
Definitely eat the chips. If you enjoy the chips, that's...
I don't know if I'm hungry or full right now because my stomach is sending mixed signals.
There's this whole system of like gut-brain axis that tells us, when we're hungry. So the hormone is called ghrelin.
Red meat and its carcinogenic properties, and like high blood pressure and atherosclerosis.
Starchy vegetables are going to be the ones that are, again, higher in fiber.
Thank you for coming on to the podcast, Dr. Rosa Keller.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Would you like to tell us about what you do? What's your consulting? What's your profession?
Sure, yeah. So I started off as a nutrition scientist. I went to Oregon State University studying, more into the sports nutrition world, kind of understanding how specifically plants can improve exercise performance. And then during COVID, I kind of was unsure of where I wanted to go next, and so I decided to then become a dietitian after that. So I studied at UCSF, and now I have my own private practice. I work with all types of clients, adults, kids. Specifically, I like to work with sports nutrition, body composition stuff, but I have a whole different slew of clients I see.
Okay, so speaking on sports nutrition, there's a lot of talk about supplements and how unregulation and stuff like that. Whole huge dome of topics. Mm-hmm. But are there certain supplements that have been shown scientifically through clinical studies that actually increase performance?
Yeah. So first touching on what you mentioned about how there's just so many different supplements, right? The market is huge. And I think we're constantly bombarded with so much information. And I feel like most of my clients come to me feeling like, okay, I would like to know 2, 3, 4, maybe 4 things that I should include on top of, eating healthy. And it can be really challenging. I think one of the most important things around safety before I jump into some of the benefits of supplements for exercise are a lot of supplements are not regulated and are not required to be regulated by the FDA. And so you really want to make sure that wherever you're buying supplements, it is somewhere where they are third-party tested. There's a lot of concerns around things like heavy metals and actual quality and actual amount of what you're assuming the dose is. So I would say that that's kind of my number one before we go into supplements. In terms of performance, so there was a really, really cool study done by the International Olympic Committee consensus statement. And what they did was they took some of the best exercise physiologists, nutrition scientists, things like that, and brought them all together to evaluate all of the research that's out there currently, based on, how much evidence there is, the quality of the data, et cetera. And there were 3 that came out on top. So the first one being creatine, one of the most well-studied supplements out there. I think maybe it is the most well-studied. I think there's something like 500, peer-reviewed articles out there. When it first was dropped on the market, I think there was a little bit of, nervousness around it and what its potential could have, because we actually do produce creatine in our body, but not enough for some of the performance benefits. And so creatine, what's really cool about creatine is you can get it from food a little bit, so red meat, seafood, things like that. But we know it to be very safe because it's so well studied and very effective in increasing, power output. So what does that mean? Power output. So let's say, you're weightlifting and you take creatine about, 60 minutes before you work out. It's going to help increase the amount of creatine in your muscles. And so, why is that important? We have something called phosphocreatine. Do you know a little bit about phosphocreatine?
I haven't heard of it.
Okay. So phosphocreatine is kind of one of those immediate energy sources that we need to have. Let's say you're doing a 100-meter sprint or you need to quickly lift something. You need energy that's on board right away rather than taking the time to, go through, I think we talked about this earlier, but cellular respiration, all of that takes time. It takes oxygen. So having something on board right away to be able to do that muscular work is really important. So if we can increase the amount of creatine in our muscles, that's going to have a really big impact on how much we can lift, how many reps we can do. And so that is, in a nutshell, the benefit of creatine overall.
Okay. So you talked about like the phosphocreatine being like on board, like at 50 meter sprint, stuff like that. Is that, so it's more useful for like 1 rep max, or is it also useful for like endurance running or like high rep ranges?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So initially, a lot of the research was in, lifting primarily. But we've also started to find that it helps with endurance and aerobic exercise, especially, in sports games. And the reason is it also helps with glycogen storage in our muscles. So a little bit about what is glycogen storage. Glycogen storage just means having excess or a little more carbohydrates on board when you're doing, say, 30 minutes of work, 100 or an hour of work or something like that. And so, yes, creatine has that immediate benefit of, lifting something heavy, for example, but it can also have that long-term benefit in increasing glycogen storage in the muscle as well. And so that you're able to go at the same, workload for a longer period of time. So I guess that would be kind of like endurance or aerobic exercise.
Okay. So I know that there's some dosing differences, like creatine has like loading and maintenance phases. Mm-hmm. What would you recommend to like each category of like athletes or weight training people or people that are just, they want to take creatine in general?
Yeah. So I would say, most of the research looks at what's called, like you mentioned, the loading phase and the maintenance phase. So the loading phase looks a little bit more like 20 grams per day for about 5 to 7 days. And the reason is because, let's say, you hadn't been, eating a lot of creatine in your diet and it wasn't something you've been taking for a while, and you want to, maximize the amount of creatine for the amount of work in a shorter period of time. So that 20 grams over 5 to 7 days is kind of like the optimal dose to kind of ramp it up initially. After the 5 to 7 days, then you would go more into like, depending on your weight, 3 to 5 grams a day. And I would say that for some individuals that, let's say they're an athlete, right? They have a high, amount of work that they're doing consistently. Doing the loading phase could provide benefit. But for like you and me and most of us who are just trying to, increase our body, our lean body mass, just doing like the 3 to 5 grams a day will still get you to the optimal amount of creatine storage. It just takes a little longer. So instead of, a week to 2 weeks, it's more like, 2 to 4 where you're actually going to get like the maximum benefit from it.
Okay. So we're seeing a benefit that's very clear and it's very well studied. What is the effect size like approximately? What would you say for like a beginner lifter? Mm-hmm. What is the rep difference? Is it 1 or 2 or?
Yeah. So, thinking about just, from an anecdotal point of view from, my clients as well, thinking about, studies that are out there, I would say that for a lot of individuals, if taken at the proper time, because timing matters with creatine, you want to take it about 30 to 60 minutes before exercise. That's when it's most effective. It's also most effective, when you take it with a carbohydrate source. So if you think about it, having the energy from the carbohydrates and then that immediate energy from the creatine is going to help increase your output. I would say, I don't know, I have an exact number, but I would say, a lot of individuals will find that they can, start increasing their weight by, 5 to 10 pounds every week and increase their reps by, 1 to 2, per week, but over a set of 3. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Like that's a huge difference, especially depending on where you're talking about. Cause like beginners get beginner gains. Like
exactly.
They'll increase rep ranges faster. Mm-hmm. But if that can be seen in like intermediate lifters, that's insane.
Yeah. And I think it's, again, timing is huge because I think a lot of lifters probably already do take creatine, but timing is huge. And then, maximizing, your carbohydrates and your protein around exercise is going to be important too. But definitely, like you said, for beginners, it's going to have, a larger effect on them. But yeah.
Yeah. That's so with the timing of creatine, if you take it after you work out, is that does that actually matter? Is that just wasted creatine, or is that does it actually make an effect for the next day, for example?
Yeah, I think, or based on what I know, it still contributes to, creatine storage in the muscle. But in terms of what we know about the research showing performance benefit, it's maximized when it's taken before working out. And that makes sense, right? When you have it immediately and then you put on that load on your body, it's going to be a little bit more effective. Let's say you take it after working out only. You're still using your muscle throughout the day, right? You're walking, you're running, you're going up the stairs, you're doing things. So in some way, it might be, utilized before you work out the next day.
Okay, but the acute benefits are, not there.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Interesting. So there's also a ton of different kinds of creatine on the market. Mm-hmm. What would you recommend as like the most researched, well-studied version of creatine?
So 100% across the board, taking anything other than creatine monohydrate is not recommended. That is the, isolated form of it. It's the form that's been studied, and other things like creatine salts, and, other compounds that they've, included with the creatine to increase absorption or improve digestion, things like that, are not recommended. I would say for most of my clients, and in general, taking it just as a creatine monohydrate powder is my recommendation for individuals, because when we get into pre-workouts that have a ton of other ingredients, let's say maybe you're sensitive to caffeine, or some individuals have negative effects with niacin or beta-alanine, things like that. So when you're starting to take something like this, especially when it's new, doing it in its isolated form is going to, number one, show you whether it works or not, and also make it a bit safer.
Okay. Yeah, speaking of pre-workouts, I know that I personally take energy drinks. I've used pre-workout before, and some of these caffeine levels are really scary. Like 300, 400 milligrams, especially if you don't take caffeine like daily, can really be too much. Mm-hmm. So I guess like for some of you who's like just starting to work out, who's just starting, like maybe they drink black coffee or whatever, mm-hmm. would you recommend pre-workout, or would you say like, just stick to like individual stuff that you can buy?
Yeah, good question. I think a lot of people have that question. And so when you're taking caffeine in the form of an energy drink, just let me ask you one question. Are you a normal caffeine drinker? Like, is it something that makes you feel anxious, or is it like sustainable for you?
It's sustainable for me. I drink caffeine pretty much every day.
Yeah, definitely. So in terms of the research around how much is too much, generally, again, similar to creatine, you want to take it 30 to 60 minutes before exercise. That's when it's going to be most effective. It takes about 45 minutes for your body to absorb it and be able to use it. And again, very high up there on the list of one of the supplements I was mentioning earlier of the top three: number one, creatine; number two, caffeine, showing really good to strong evidence for a performance benefit, including things like power output, endurance, time to exhaustion, things like that. In terms of like safety, generally the performance effect is around 3 to 6 milligrams per kilo. So actually, let's say you're, a 70 kilo adult, you're up in like the 210 milligrams. So that's actually getting kind of close to, what's considered the performance effect. So, and I think a cup of coffee has anywhere from like 65 to 80 milligrams. So let's say you're someone that already drinks coffee regularly. Number one, I would suggest drink that coffee, 30 to 60 minutes before exercise. See if you notice a benefit. For some, tolerance is a factor, right? And so let's say you're a pretty high intense active athlete, definitely going up into the 200, 300, even up to 400, depending on your weight, is safe. Depending on how it makes you feel, that's another question. I think for some people, the anxiety that comes with caffeine intake can be an issue. I would say in terms of like my preferred source of caffeine, you can get it from caffeine pills, you can get it from coffee, tea, and energy drinks. I would say, in my opinion, getting it from coffee or tea is the preferred way, because not only the caffeine, but if you think about the coffee bean or green tea, there's a lot of other benefits. So antioxidants, different polyphenols that we know also play a role in cardiovascular health and recovery, actually. So that would be what I would recommend to someone first starting off. Maybe if you're normally doing 1 cup of coffee, could you try, putting that a little closer to when you work out, or maybe doubling that cup of coffee.
Okay.
One other really interesting thing, because I always like to include like why food is relevant to this, is caffeine is more effective when you have a carbohydrate source. So a carbohydrate source would be a piece of toast with nut butter or something, avocado toast. What are some other ones? Like a granola bar or, an apple. The creatine and the caffeine become more effective when you actually have that pre-workout snack.
Okay, so that's what you'd recommend, like a piece of toast or a granola bar or something like that. Like that's like that before workout. I've seen like Rice Krispie treats. I don't know if that's advised, but I've seen that before workouts too. Is that that's the reason why that works for people? Yeah,
no, definitely. I mean, I think because Rice Krispie treats are like a processed food, we have issues with. Again, your body is going to use that energy because you're taking it for a purpose. And so you're giving your body the most accessible sugar or carbohydrate, simple carbs it needs to do the work. So that's interesting. I didn't know people did that, but that makes a lot of sense, is why, you're getting the quickest form of energy in addition to the creatine and caffeine for exercise.
Okay.
I think someone was telling me that NFL players, all they do is just eat candy all day because they need actually that energy. They're using it.
And I guess the main concern for me would be if you're eating a bunch of sugar, then you could crash. I know with certain energy drinks, I crash really hard because I don't actually. That's another question. Does artificial sweetener kind of have that same crashing effect as sugar, or is that just the caffeine?
Yeah, good question. So with sugar, and we can definitely go a lot more into sugar and crashing and what that even means. Again, if you're using that energy and let's say you hadn't had a meal in a while, there's a potential for a crash. But again, if you've had let's say breakfast 2 to 3 hours before you work out, and then you have a Rice Krispie treat, again, your body is going to burn through that Rice Krispie treat super easy. And so there shouldn't be too much of a crash. Caffeine is one thing to consider in terms of crash. And then in terms of artificial sweeteners, so that's a really good question. I'm not sure, but they don't affect your blood sugar. And the crash from sugar is that spike in your blood sugar coming down and leading to low blood sugar. That's where we get tired, moody, hangry, hungry, angry. But with artificial sweeteners, they are not metabolized the same way. And so from my understanding, they don't cause that crash, but I'd be happy to look into it a little more because I do have a lot of clients these days getting more into the artificial sweeteners, and it is a really hot topic.
Yeah, because I know that there's this whole thing with aspartame is a big scary thing that people see people see it as big and scary. And then there's this, it's 0 sugar, so I can drink as much Diet Coke as I want, for example. So that was, I guess, do you think is there any research saying that it's no risk? Or is there some sort of negative side to drinking?
Yeah, so I believe the most recent studies that were coming out, a lot of them, again, are preclinical models. So they're looking at rodents and things like that. I don't think we have a lot of good evidence. And that's one of the challenges with nutrition, is that to really have good evidence in a human model or in a clinical trial to show that it has long-term negative effects takes a lot of time and work, right? But from a perspective of looking at someone's diet as a whole, if they're switching out a Coca-Cola for a Diet Coke once a day, I think that's a good trade-off because you're reducing the excess carbohydrates. Let's say that person's sedentary, they're not using that energy, then I think it's a good trade-off. Let's say you are a ultra marathon runner or a cyclist and you like to drink a Diet Coke before or after working out. Your body's going to just use that energy. So I would say I don't have a problem, and I don't think most dietitians do because it reduces the need to have a lot of excess sugar, especially in the form of liquid, which is a big problem in this country.
Yeah, that's true. I understand that longitudinal problem. Diet soda has been fairly recent, so the idea that we don't have longitudinal data is not really that surprising. But yeah.
One of the cool alternatives, though, I've seen more of is, have you heard of Olipop? and poppy and stuff.
The prebiotic.
Yeah. So those are really cool because I think they really bring down the amount of carbohydrates, but they increase. So prebiotic is again just a word for like fiber or certain types of fiber. And that actually helps reduce the overall, calories from sugar. I think, they're much less. And, there's some other added benefits, but they've used things like hickory root. Some of them use monk fruit. Some of these things that are like more natural artificial sweeteners that, give a similar taste. So if people are really concerned or fearful of artificial sweeteners, those are good options. But overall, I think a Diet Coke a day won't kill you.
Yeah. Especially when it's an alternative to like an actual Coke. So I guess related to nutrition, what do you feel about this whole conversation with good food and bad food? Is this worth talking about? Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's one of the biggest messages I try to share with a lot of my clients, because I think, in this world of going on Instagram and going on YouTube and being bombarded with, all of these different ways to eat, right? Like, only eating fruit. I see that, or, thinking that, certain, I saw this one that was like saying that like the peppercorns and black pepper are like rat poison. Like people, like a client yesterday actually mentioned that to me. So there's so much stuff that people are seeing, and it's definitely fear mongering. And usually if you take couple steps further and figure out why that person's saying it, it usually has to do with trying to convince you to buy something. The healthcare industry, or the health supplement marketing industry is massive. And so I think, all of that to say that the more we try to associate foods as bad or good or dangerous or evil, the harder time we have with paying attention to what really matters. I find a lot of my clients, specifically if they have history of disordered eating, but then find themselves in situations where they binge, that control is actually not working against them, thinking like having a cookie is bad, therefore they hide that cookie until they can, overconsume. And that can be really, challenging and really scary for a lot of people. And so my biggest message and what I try to convey to most of my clients is there's no good food, there's no bad food, there's just foods you should eat more, and there's food you should eat less frequently. One of the main ways I try to help my clients through that, because it's easier said than done, is educating them, like, for example, what is a carbohydrate and why are they, evil, right? In this few years, it's going to change. It's going to be fat or protein. Right now, protein is, the cool one. But yeah, I think, the 80-20 rule is what I often use. So have you heard of it before? I've heard of it with other things, but not.
Okay. Yeah. And it works in most things, right? So I think moderation is key. 80-20 being 80% of the time, if you can eat primarily a whole foods diet, meaning fruits, vegetables, grains, beans, nuts, animal protein, dairy, if you're not lactose intolerant. If you can do that 80% of the meals in a week or 80% of the meals in a month, 20% of the time, especially as we get close to Thanksgiving, 20% of the time, eat the cookie, eat the popcorn, eat the burger, enjoy yourself. Otherwise it doesn't become sustainable. And if it's not sustainable, you're not going to be consistent. And if you're not consistent, all of that hard work isn't going to really make a difference. And so that is kind of the general theme of how I interact with my clients.
Okay. And I know that, at least in my experience, my willpower decreases the longer I have something in my kitchen. So when I have a bag of chips, I can resist it for a certain amount of time, but at a certain point, I just eat it anyways. Mm-hmm. So is there a way to I guess, you talked about hiding food, that doesn't seem sustainable. Mm-hmm. But is there a way to combat that losing willpower over time?
Yeah. So couple things is, again, we hope to make some of these changes, but it's not always easy right away, right? So sometimes we have to learn to make an extra step or a barrier to make it a little more of a moment of, okay, do I actually want that, or am I kind of mindlessly eating, for example? So one thing I tell my clients is, if you want to eat more fruit, put fruit out on your table. If you want to eat the chips less, put them in the cupboard, put them away from like your gaze, because that makes it a lot easier. Definitely eat the chips. If you enjoy the chips, that's fine. But if you feel like it's getting like, a bit out of hand, or it's kind of, not making you feel well. One thing I also like to talk about in terms of snacking is, can you pair that chip with a dip? Can you take that carbohydrate chip and add protein to it? Can you, do hummus and pita chips? Can you change it a little bit so that overall you feel more satisfied from the meal? And it feels more like a real meal or snack.
Yeah, because I know that if I just slam a bunch of chips, I don't feel full afterward. I feel full for like 30 minutes, but after that, I'm back to being hungry again after 600 calories later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And so that's another really important factor in all of this is, yes, our society makes, carbohydrate, salty, fatty snacks and foods really easily accessible, right? And so how do we, change the way we eat slightly so that we feel satisfied? And so a big part of that is, incorporating the protein. So, when I say protein, I mean, plants and animals. So could that be like adding cheese? Could that be beans? Could that be a yogurt dip? Things like that to the chips. And you'll notice maybe if you try it that you'll feel a little more satisfied, and the consumption or the ratio of like chip to protein and some of those other things will be a little more balanced.
Yeah, so it seems like protein is like this big satiation thing. It's a really big nutrition thing. Mm-hmm. What's the recommended amount of protein we should have in a day? I guess.
Yeah.
I know there are different categories for lifters and stuff, but
yeah,
you can
exactly.
On that.
So the guidelines for Americans is 0 or 0.8. I think it's 0.8 grams per kilo, I think, which in my opinion, and based on a lot of the research we know about, maintaining muscle mass, especially as we get older, and if you are an athlete or exercise in some way, we need a little bit more than that. So I would say for most of my clients, depending on how active they are, anywhere from 1.5 to 2 grams per kilo is what I recommend. And I think a really important part of all of this is, yes, protein is important, but when you think about protein, what do you think of? What are the first things that come to mind for you?
Things that, meat and protein powder.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that's how most of us are, right? We think, some people actually don't even think of cheese, but dairy, definitely, meat, seafood, protein powder. But there are so many plant-based proteins too that we also don't factor in. So things like, lentils, beans, nuts, tofu, soy milk, fruits and vegetables have a little bit of protein too, and grains. So I think when we're thinking about protein intake, factoring in everything is important, because a lot of us probably are getting, at least the minimum. It's when you're, a performance athlete, or you're trying to, have a really big change in your lean body mass, that you need to supplement with things like protein powder and maybe eat a little bit more, red meat. But there are plenty of, vegetarian, pescatarian athletes out there that are capable of maintaining their muscle mass too.
Yeah, I've heard that beans and my parents tell me this, that beans and rice makes a whole protein. How do combining two different things make a whole protein? What does that mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'll step back just a little bit and say that so a complete protein means that it has all 9 essential amino acids that we don't make enough of in our own body, that we need to get from our diet. And there are 2 plant proteins that do have all 9 essential amino acids, and that is soy and quinoa. So those ones on their own actually do have enough. When you think about other plant foods, so kind of what your parents were saying is that, beans and rice separate don't have all of those 9 essential amino acids, but when you combine them in a meal, they do. And so you're getting what you need from them. And so that's a really good example of how, many cultures around the world eat, right? Beans and rice, or different forms of a lentil and a rice, things like that.
Yeah, I know that the idea behind amino acids, I've seen a little bit of controversy around protein powder and amino acids. Mm-hmm. That you can say that, I have I have 27 grams of protein, let's pick an impressive number, grams of protein in my protein powder, but it's amino acids that you can't, I've heard that there are amino acids that you can't use, or it's kind of is technically 27 grams of protein, but it's not 27 grams of usable protein. Mm-hmm. Is there truth to that?
So you're specifically talking about like whole protein sources, not like the individual amino acid powders out there?
Yeah, like I don't want to bring up brands, but like, yeah, like certain brands of protein powder will say that they have 27 grams of protein.
Yeah. So your body is really smart and it's going to use what it needs, right? I think when we think about protein, all we think about is muscle mass, but protein has a lot of other, things that it does. Every cell in your body is using protein in some way or another to keep you alive, right? And so in terms of like what we know about like branched chain amino acids, for example, we know that those have a more significant impact on muscle mass. But if you're getting like a whey protein isolate, that is going to meet your needs just fine. And again, if you are vegan or vegetarian and you choose more of like a plant-based protein, you also get your needs met because they are, often, made to have all of those 9 essential. And so there's a little bit of information around like how anabolic, so how much like a whey protein or an animal-based protein compared to a plant protein actually increase lean body mass. There's a little bit more evidence to show that, whey protein animal-based is going to have a greater impact on your ability to increase your muscle mass than plant protein. But I think we're starting to find a lot more research showing that that difference is negligible. Yeah.
Okay.
If that kind of answers your question.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay.
But I heard you brought up BCAAs, and I know that you can take them independently. Mm-hmm. Is that something that's worth doing, taking BCAAs? Yeah.
So I mentioned that study in the beginning about the, consensus statement around, what compounds are effective or not. The branched chain amino acids are included. It was shown to have some evidence to, improve performance. But again, if you are getting those branched chain amino acids from your food, number one, that's always going to be number one, and your protein powder, taking them, in addition to that, not enough evidence from what I know that it's going to have much of a performance impact the way, creatine, caffeine, and then the third one I hadn't mentioned is nitrate are going to have. And I think one of the most important things with my clients specifically is that when I start them on any of these, they should be able to feel a difference, right? I think with a lot of supplements, there's a big placebo effect, and there's not an expectation that you should be able to notice a difference. And so bringing on any sort of new supplement one at a time and doing it for 2 to 4 weeks would be my recommendation so that you can actually say, okay, this is actually worth my money to continue to take.
Yeah, and you also brought up the, whey protein isolate. There are a couple different kinds of whey protein. I've heard you can take them at different times. Is there like a certain one that you recommend for a different time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a good question. So we talked a little bit about like carbs, protein, haven't talked about fat too much, but in terms of like performance and let's say you're working out at the gym. So I would say, let's say you're weightlifting for, 60 minutes. Prioritizing carbohydrates before is more important than protein. The carbohydrates are needed for that energy you're going to use. In terms of protein, I would say the recommended time to take is after. And I think most people are pretty good about that, is within 30 to 60 minutes after exercise. That would be one of the greatest times to take the protein because, again, your muscles have been worked and torn, and you need to give yourself enough amino acids so that your pool of overall amino acids in your body is able to maintain that increase in muscle mass. In terms of like body composition in general and like how to eat protein throughout the day, we've found overall that it doesn't really matter, how much you have at one time. For a long time, and I can share this study with you afterwards, for a long time, people said you can only absorb 20 to 40 grams of protein at once, and so you need to consume it many different times. There's been a recent study that looked into this and overall found that that actually didn't play a factor. It was the overall amount of protein you got throughout the day. But in terms of body composition, so let's say someone that wants to, lose fat mass and gain lean body mass, the recommendation is if you can get at least 100 grams of protein between breakfast, let's say a snack, and lunch, that is going to help not only keep you satiated, but give you the amount of protein you need throughout your day to maintain that muscle mass. It also puts a lot less pressure on dinner, which I think a lot of us skip breakfast, eat a light lunch, and then go really heavy with dinner. And I think one of the biggest recommendations that I find myself giving is, okay, how can we switch this up a little bit? Let's see how we can get more protein in your breakfast. Let's see how we can get more protein in your lunch. So at least they are a little more even, if not more, in the beginning part of your day. Because dinner, oftentimes what happens is we overeat, and then we either, don't feel very good after. A lot of individuals find they have more like acid reflux because eating a big meal and laying down, especially if it's high in protein and fat. So for many reasons, I would say over and over in many different scenarios, incorporating more protein, in breakfast, snack, lunch, and then after workout would be my recommendation.
That's interesting because I know intermittent fasting, at least, I don't know if it's gone out of trend, but it has been a huge driver for a lot of people for their plans. But what you said kind of goes against, at least from what I'm seeing, it goes against intermittent fasting because if you skip breakfast, then you can't even out your protein distribution, and then you eat too much in dinner and you risk acid reflux and all this stuff. Mm-hmm. So do you recommend intermittent fasting or?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one thing about the protein is often, and maybe try this actually, but for many people when they eat, more protein or a more substantial breakfast and lunch, they have better control of their blood sugar overall, and they have less cravings, and they're able to eat a little bit in more moderation with dinner, which then ends up helping them long term with weight loss or changes in body composition. In terms of intermittent fasting, you could still do it. You'd just be eating dinner at 5 p.m., right? But I would say, the research is really interesting in the benefits of intermittent fasting, thinking about reducing, any intake so that your body taps more into fat oxidation, right? Is one of the main things that I think made it so popular, aside from some of the metabolic, molecular benefits. But for many individuals, the benefit in terms of changes in body composition and weight loss actually come from just shortening that window of eating, right? It's not necessarily that, you are, in such a large state of fat oxidation over that 12 or 16 hour period that whatever you eat in that other period of 8, 10, 12 hours is mitigated in some way. It's more that a lot of us can't get in as much in a shorter window of time. And so that is oftentimes where that change comes from. It is not make or break. You can definitely still be successful without intermittent fasting. And I think for many people, it actually is a bit counterintuitive, because what happens is when we don't eat for a long period of time, let's say, you wake up at 7 a.m. and you fast until noon. A lot of people are going to find that maybe there's a little bit of period of time where they have that cognitive benefit, right? Some people say they get into a period of ketosis and their mental clarity is better, focus. But for a lot of people, especially individuals that might already have chronic disease, it can actually impact your blood sugar worse when you do have lunch. It can also create fatigue. Some people, when they're really hungry or have such a low blood sugar for that amount of time, can find that they feel angry, moody. And for someone, I have one client, he's, started to get much more into his nutrition and exercise, and he was not eating enough for how much he was exercising. He was, skipping breakfast, working out in the morning. And he even said his coworkers were the quote at work for him was don't talk to him before lunch, And so it was really negatively impacting his life. And once we started, a little bit of a snack before working out, a solid breakfast, and a solid lunch, it changed everything for him in terms of his mood and his ability to focus at work. So it really depends on the person. If it works for you, great. But it's probably just the shortening window of time to eat that's making the impact.
Yeah, and I can imagine that shortening that window becomes tricky, right? Because there's a part of your brain that says, well, I haven't eaten breakfast. So for lunch, I'll have probably a medium-sized lunch, but for dinner, they binge. Mm-hmm. And then if they're on intermittent fasting, they might be already conscious about calorie counting and stuff, and they might purge.
Exactly.
So is there a concern with eating disorders, or is that like...
I haven't looked too much into specifically any evidence around like, does intermittent fasting cause, more disordered eating habits? I would say that individuals that do have, somewhat of a poor relationship with food or periods of like binging and purging, that any sort of diet or any sort of strict regimen, whether that's counting your calories, intermittent fasting, or trying to abide by very strict rules around food, is counterintuitive to trying to improve that relationship with food and ultimately get yourself to a healthy place. Definitely. Yeah. Another thing about the intermittent fasting that I wanted to mention is when we get really hungry, and what do we often reach for, right? Carbohydrates, because it is the body's preferred source of energy. It's the fastest to absorb. It's the fastest to be used. Our brain only functions or utilizes carbohydrates or sugar, glucose, and ketones. And so oftentimes, if you're, somewhat starving yourself of carbohydrates, that can have a negative impact on your ability to feel like you're in control of your food choices, right? When you're really hungry, and then if you're already in a cycle of disordered eating or poor relationship with food, and you do eat that food, then you have guilt and shame, and it's kind of like a vicious cycle that's, I find most easily broken by, again, talking to a dietitian, of course, and just having a better understanding of what foods, should eat and intuitive eating. So, am I hungry? Am I full? And how to feel like you're in control of those cues, because that can also be lost, right? I think some individuals find it hard to even acknowledge whether they're hungry or full.
Yeah, I've had that before. I always confused my mom. Like, I don't know if I'm hungry or full right now because my stomach is sending mixed signals.
Yeah.
And part of that, I feel like, I don't know if this is true, was because I eat pretty quickly. So is there any evidence that says like eating slower may help, actually make you eat the amount that you're supposed to eat instead of overeating and then feeling bloated and full?
Definitely. So we have a hunger hormone called leptin, and that plays a role in signaling to our brain that we are full, right? There's this whole system of like gut-brain axis that tells us, when we're hungry. So the hormone is called ghrelin. Kind of sounds like, your stomach is rumbling, ghrelin. But when we eat fast, we don't give ourselves enough time to have our, nerves in our stomach signal to our brain, oh, I'm full. And so eating fast is one of the ways that it makes it tricky. If you think about it, right, in American, Western culture, we order our own plate and then we eat whatever's on that plate, right? So if you eat that really fast, are you even paying attention to, how hungry you are, how full you're starting to get, versus, let's say, family style, you share a meal and, you're eating a lot of different textures, a lot of different foods. You're making the active choice of putting something on your plate. So that's another option or a moment of making that decision. Am I hungry still? And then when we eat over a longer period of time in a more social setting, that also lengthens the time that our stomach gets to tell our brain, I'm full. So eating fast definitely plays a role. And then let's say you go from really hungry, you eat really fast, to really full, but you don't figure that out until 10 minutes later. Then you're like, I don't know what hunger and fullness feels like.
Yeah, and then if you're talking about like, let's say you have 30 minutes off on your break and you drive to a fast food place because you can't go anywhere else in that time, and you get a plate of food, you're like, I don't want to waste it. There's nowhere I can store it. You eat the entire thing and you still feel hungry afterwards. Is that like, but it doesn't, I guess it doesn't make sense to me because you've eaten volume. You've eaten a lot of volume, a lot of calories, and yet you still feel hungry despite the number of calories you've eaten.
Yeah.
So what would affect hunger, like hunger signals, if not calories?
Yeah. So in that case, I'm trying to think of like previous clients that have like had that, or if I've experienced that. I think if that's happening, there's probably a disconnect between, understanding hunger versus appetite, right? We eat for many different reasons. We eat for physiological hunger. We also eat for emotional, reasons as well. And not that one is better or worse, but sometimes, that emotional eating or the stress eating is more of kind of a mental situation versus physical hunger. So physical hunger sounds like, or, some ways to understand physical hunger. Let's say you smell like French fries from the room, 2 doors down, and like, you that almost overtakes your mind. That is, a key sign of hunger. When your stomach grumbles, when you start to feel physically low energy, you maybe get a little moody. Those are feelings of, hunger. Whereas appetite, or let's say emotional eating, is oftentimes when we're bored or we're stressed or we want something to take away from the stress that we're feeling. Because again, like I said, our brain prefers carbohydrates as energy, right? And so that's why sugar can be so addictive, is it soothes us in some way. So I think really starting to, focus on being more present with eating, focusing on that balance, like we talked about with the chips, having some vegetables on your plate is huge. We want that fiber, having the protein, having healthy sources of fats, olive oil, salmon, etc. Those sort of things are going to help with feelings of fullness. Another reason why fast food might not make you feel full is it's a lot of simple carbohydrates, right? And so usually, fatty foods keep us satiated. But let's say, you got fries and, a lot of your meal was carbohydrates. Your body's going to, use that and burn through that relatively quickly. Versus, let's say, you go somewhere else and you get, a bowl that has, quinoa or rice and like teriyaki chicken and, spinach. And it has, a lot of volume and a lot of fiber and a lot of balance in terms of protein, carbs, fat, fruits, vegetables, etc. That is going to feel much different in terms of feelings of fullness than maybe like the McDonald's or something like that.
So it's like mainly the simple carbs that would mess it up.
Yeah, I think, also not being familiar with what being hungry or full feels like. Has that happened to you before, where you're like, you got like fast food and like 30 minutes later you were hungry?
Yeah, or it's like I have that with certain restaurants I can't go to, or fast food places I can't go to because it make my stomach feel weird. Mm-hmm. And the weirdness makes my brain think it's hunger. But usually if I wait it out like 30 minutes, I'm fine. It's not hunger.
Yeah, that is another good point, is that sometimes when food makes us feel a little sick, mm-hmm. Especially things like fast food, again, that really heavy fat, those sort of things, it can feel like, hunger, or maybe you're associating any sort of feeling in your stomach with the feeling of hunger, right? So that is actually something I can relate with and make sense, is bloating in our stomach, so like under our diaphragm, whether you have bloating and gas with fast food, or you have bloating and gas with gluten or wheat or whatever, sometimes that feeling can be hard to like understand what's going on. Definitely.
Okay. I remember you brought up something that I really wanted to talk about. I guess we can talk about like fat, because I know that there's a concern with I guess this kind of leads into the fat topic of like red meat and its carcinogenic properties, and like high blood pressure and atherosclerosis, and like scary stuff. So is that more of a variety question of like, okay, red meat is good, but you can like eat other types of meat too? Or
yeah, definitely. So I do work with a lot of people that have high cholesterol. And a lot of the work I did in the past, in terms of research, was around cardiovascular health. And we do know that, animal protein, right? Red meat, dairy, chicken, fish, etc., does have more saturated fat. And there is a very strong link between saturated fat and the increase in our cholesterol. So what is cholesterol? Cholesterol is our particles that carry around fat in our body, right? And there's the ones that carry fat from our liver and to other parts of our body and back to our liver. And so that's how we kind of differentiate between, what is good cholesterol, what is bad cholesterol. But overall, we know that saturated fat affects our total cholesterol and our LDL levels. I would say, that red meat, in my opinion, has benefits, right? Again, it's about that moderation, the frequency of consumption, and whether you have, chronic disease or other, like for example, if you genetically have high cholesterol in your family, maybe you have to think about, reducing it slightly. I am a meat eater. I think that eating, meat and all types of foods is, again, there's no good or bad food. There's just how much you can consume it. And if you are someone that does have higher risk of cardiovascular disease, eating leaner sources of red meat would be my recommendation. Also, I mentioned fiber a little bit here and there today, but fiber, we know, is one of the best ways to help with lowering cholesterol from a diet perspective, because cholesterol is involved in bile acid metabolism. And when we eat fiber, fiber is a carbohydrate that our body doesn't use for energy, but it does feed our gut microbiome. And it also helps to excrete excess bile acids, therefore excreting excess cholesterol. So by increasing your fiber well above the recommendation, which I think the recommendation is like maybe 30 grams or so, going more up into like the 40s, 50s, continuing to increase that can help bring your cholesterol down, can help minimize some of the potential, negative effects of red meat. I would say from also a cardiovascular perspective, thinking about, like you said, high blood pressure, things like that, some other things you can do as well is incorporate more leafy green vegetables. So we talked a little bit about like those performance supplements, right? And this one ties really well into this cardiovascular topic. So nitrate, dietary nitrate, is a compound that I think when we hear the word nitrate, we think processed meat, we think bacon, we think cancer, right? There is some evidence to show that, processed meat can have negative effects on gastric cancer. Is it the nitrate that's causing it? That is not as clear. So, and the reason I say that is, fun fact also, when you see bacon that says no nitrate, that's not true. So legally, they have to put nitrate in processed meat because it's a preservative. So instead of putting sodium nitrate or nitrite, they put celery salt. Celery salt is high in nitrate or nitrate. And the reason is most plants are very high in nitrate. So things like spinach, bok choy, leafy green vegetables, things we know that are good for our cardiovascular system are high in nitrate. And that's because they get the nitrogen from the soil, they store it in the leaves, all of that. But we also have found that the potassium and the nitrate in leafy green vegetables, root vegetables, can actually lower blood pressure in individuals with high blood pressure, even individuals who we call normotensive, so have a normal blood pressure. It can actually have acute effects on lowering it. And so it plays a really big role in atherosclerosis, reducing plaques, improving the vasodilation of our blood vessels, therefore delivering more oxygen, delivering more nutrients to our muscles. And so tying it back into what we talked about earlier with the performance effect, in the last 20 or 30 years, it's very well studied that beetroot juice, celery juice, spinach juice, or powder forms of these things, when consumed at a high enough dose, I think it's about 400 milligrams, has an acute and a chronic performance effect. So it reduces the oxygen cost of exercise. So you're able to do more work longer and surprisingly even feel like it was easier. So your perceived exertion is reduced. And so that has effects for not only you and me or, an elite athlete, but it also benefits individuals that have things like COPD or cardiovascular disease by just increasing their ability to maybe, move their legs a little bit more or improve their gait or help with their breathing, for example. Those are ways in which nitrate can be both a performance benefit and also be really effective in encouraging more vegetables in the diet.
That's cool that you can get it like by plants and stuff, because I guess it's not commonly known that you can do that. Mm-hmm. It sounds like a really good thing to, like, if you want to, you can supplement into your diet, but why was it banned?
So it's not that it's banned, it's that there's a negative association with nitrate in the form of sodium nitrate as a preservative with meat, because so much of that research showed that, processed meat, which has nitrate in it, can cause gastric cancer and form something called nitrosamines. But all of the works done so far, I studied this in grad school, but all the work done so far has shown no association with the formation of these nitrosamines or concern for gastric cancer when nitrate is consumed at much higher levels from plants. And then you think about like how much is enough, right? How much do we need to have these effects? It's about 4 to 6 cups of raw spinach. So that's doable, right? Like, especially if you cook it, it turns into like a tiny little wad, but, you can add it to your smoothie. You can have it in your salad. You can mix it into soups, and it's not just spinach, right? You can do celery, beets, other things, but very safe. And it's starting to gain a lot of traction. Initially it was gaining traction in terms of the benefits for performance in humans, and especially in cyclists and runners. But now a lot more doctors and a lot more cardiovascular specialists are paying attention to the benefits as well.
You mentioned a couple ways that you can introduce spinach into your diet. Mm-hmm. I'm terrible about eating vegetables, so I would love to hear like different ways that you can introduce these things. You said like in soups and stuff.
Yeah. So do you like Asian food?
I love Asian food.
Okay. So Asian food is, a good example of ways in which you can add a lot of vegetables, right? With still getting a lot of flavor. I'm half Taiwanese, and what's really common at the table is like a huge heaping stir fry of like cabbage or spinach or bok choy or something like that. And so thinking about it in terms of like, okay, if I'm going to make a stir fry, if I'm going to make noodles, ramen, soup, etc., can I take a couple extra steps to, throw in a little more vegetables? It's going to make it, again, higher in fiber, higher in nitrate, higher in a lot of the other, polyphenols and antioxidant benefits. And overall, we know that there's such a strong relationship between, green leafy vegetable and vegetable consumption and health. So what are your top vegetables that you would go to the store like right after this and have in your house?
Do potatoes count?
Yeah, they don't. They're not green and leafy, but they count.
Yeah. Leafy, lean vegetables. It shows how little I eat vegetables. Probably spinach. I'm not experienced in cooking like bok choy or anything. Okay. Broccoli a little bit.
Okay.
But yeah.
Yeah. So I would say if you do a smoothie ever, that's a really great way to get protein in. Your protein powder, your Greek yogurt, your frozen berries, etc. And then as much spinach as you can possibly, stuff into that is one thing I recommend for individuals who are kind of newer to incorporating more vegetables. I would say, when you're making a pasta, for example, can you add a little bit of spinach? Can you try to start incorporating a small salad before you get into your dinner, whether that's, arugula, spinach, and it can be simple. It doesn't need to be a big step into trying to incorporate all of these different foods in many ways, but starting small by incorporating it into, at least 2 meals a day. So when you're making a sandwich, can you put a little bit more lettuce? Soups, again, I said soups and stews. It's kind of like, colder time right now. And so that's a really easy way to, get a lot more because like I said, when you cook it, it gets a lot smaller and more attainable to eat like 6 cups of spinach.
Yeah, I've heard that I don't know if this is myth, but I'm asking you, I guess, that if you cook things like broccoli, then they lose some of their nutritional benefit. Mm-hmm. Is this true?
Yeah, it depends on the cooking method, right? And it depends on the food. So with different things and actually what nutrients you're looking at, right? For example, with like I said, with nitrate, when you cook something like spinach and you leave it out to room temperature, it actually increases the nitrate. When they're consumed in like juices that you buy from the store, it increases the nitrate. But let's say you're talking about things like vitamins and minerals, or certain polyphenols, etc. Let's say you put broccoli and you steam it and you put it in, the water, and the water's like neon green after. You've definitely lost, some things, but to not eat the broccoli or try to always eat it raw versus, cooking it or cooking it into things, I would say that is totally fine. And also for a lot of people, they have a hard time digesting cruciferous vegetables. So like broccoli, cauliflower. And so cooking it is actually sometimes, the only way they can consume it.
Yeah, because I've heard of things like cauliflower rice and stuff, especially when people are trying to they're trying to lose weight. Mm-hmm. Cauliflower rice is lower in calories. So I've seen that.
Yeah, so cauliflower rice is a good option. I would say never replaces rice from like a texture and taste perspective, but it can be a good alternative and a really easy way to add again a little more fiber and volume to your food. I think that's one of the greatest things about, in my opinion, vegetables, fruits, and things like that, is because of the water content and the fiber content, the volume that you can consume of food is like increased, right? Or I guess the amount of like food on your plate is increased, but the calories, can be decreased. Does that make sense? Like, let's say you have like, mashed potatoes and gravy and turkey and a piece of bread, and like that's enough in that moment, but will you be a little bit more hungry, 2 hours later? Or if you were to add like a beet feta salad with nuts or something like that, would that help? And for most of my clients, they find that when they start to incorporate more fruits and vegetables and fiber in general, that their satiety and their satisfaction after a meal actually improves.
Okay. That's interesting. I guess it's like it becomes a volume thing as well. Like you can eat a plate full of salad and that has way lower calories, but it fills you up kind of the same as a pasta would, whereas a pasta is more calories. But
yeah, I think that's a hard part about like the whole idea around like calories in and calories out, right? Is that, there is some truth to it, right? Like, you need protein, carbs, and fat. And if you're not in a deficit, then it's, going to be really hard to lose weight if that's what your goal is, or lose, fat mass and gain body mass in terms of muscle. But how do we do that then? How do we feel satisfied after a meal? How do we change what we eat so that, both our gut health is improved, our digestion is improved, and we feel satisfied and happy after a meal? And the answer for, many of us and for many of my clients is increasing protein, increasing fiber, fruits and vegetables, and then also focusing on healthy fats. So fat is one of those things that's very like satiating, right? We love fat. Fat is delicious. But how can we, maximize its benefit for our health? And so generally my answer to that would be, unsaturated fat. So that's things like, and you mentioned fat earlier, I don't know if we ended up talking about it much, but things like avocado, nuts, what else? Like salmon, a little bit of animal protein in there as well. Olive oil, I would say number one in terms of like ability to provide a lot of antioxidant benefits, a lot of flavor, a lot of satisfaction, and it is generally really easy to cook with.
Is there like a guideline? I know like the food plate at least used to exist, and then I've heard some controversy about it. Is there like a general guideline, like how much of your plate do you think you should take up with each category?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So I used to work at UCSF, and what we found to be most helpful, and I still continue to use to this day, is the plate method. So instead of like the pyramid, and even like I think Harvard Health has their own version of like a plate and shows, portions and things. This plate actually shows and categorizes things a little differently. So instead of protein, carbs, and fat, it's more like non-starchy vegetables, starchy vegetables, and protein, and then fat kind of, mixed into those things a little bit. What that means is, you mentioned potatoes as a vegetable, right? Yes, that is a vegetable, but it's a starchy vegetable. So potatoes, corn, sweet potatoes, some types of peas and winter squash, those are actually higher in overall carbohydrates. And so when we eat them, they have a similar effect on our blood sugar and overall metabolism as rice, pasta, bread, etc. So that, in general, about a quarter of your plate. So that oftentimes looks like a half a cup to a cup for most of us. And then the non-starchy vegetables are going to be the ones that are, again, higher in fiber and a lot lower in the actual carbohydrates that our body's going to turn into glucose. So zucchini, cucumbers, carrots, leafy greens, what else? Onions, garlic, etc. So those are going to be the more like contribution to overall fiber intake, and other, I could go on and on about how good vegetables are, of course, but there's so many other things other than the fiber and vitamins and minerals that we know of that are also providing plenty of health benefits. So that would be about 50% of your plate. The last quarter or so, depending on who you are, right, would be protein. And what's really cool about this that I like is it incorporates both plant protein and animal proteins. So in that, little piece of the pie has soy products like tofu, soy milk, edamame, beans, nuts, other, plant-based protein as well. And then it also has, red meat, chicken, fish, eggs, etc. So I can send that to you as well, because I think it's a really great tool because it provides a visual and it's a little more intuitive than protein, carbs, and fat, because I think for a lot of us, like, we have associations with what those are, but we don't have a full understanding of what that means.
That's a very detailed breakdown. I appreciate that. Especially knowing that I can eat starchy vegetables. That makes me feel good.
Yeah, of course. Potatoes are great for you. They have tons of fiber, lots of vitamins and minerals. They get a bad rap because they're usually fried and from like fast food places, but potatoes are great. I had potatoes for dinner last night.
And I know that, well, at least for me, and I've heard of some sort of psychological benefit. I don't know if you can speak to it, but that a smaller plate will make you eat less generally than a bigger plate. Is that something that you've seen in clients where you're like, well, your dishware may be making you eat more?
Yeah, I have heard that. I haven't used it myself as a method. I think one of the more common things that I've found and am interested in is the idea of different texture, flavor, and color have a bigger impact on satisfaction with a meal and feelings of fullness. So let's say, I think they did, there was one study that looked at giving people kind of like family style food versus just a plate. And the family style, even though you have less control or knowledge of how much you eat, those people actually ate less and mentioned that they liked the variation in texture. So, you got some crunch, you've got some vegetables, you've got some noodles, rice, soup. So that actually helped individuals feel, number one, satisfied and eat less versus, again, like we were talking, having a plate of food and kind of feeling obligated to eat everything on that plate, which I think some of us, were either raised that way or feel that way. And it's a little harder to control. It would make sense to me, though, that if you ate on a smaller plate, you can put less on that plate. And so then the barrier that kind of is a helpful way of, again, checking in with yourself is, okay, I finished everything. Am I still hungry? If I am, you have to actually put the work into go getting more food. And that's a moment where we can utilize it as making a conscious decision around, am I still hungry? Do I want to eat more? Or versus filling up a plate with, sometimes our eyes are, bigger than our stomach. And so we put a lot, but again, I also don't want to say like that, eating, to fullness and, having a lot of different things on your plate is necessarily a bad thing. I think, we're getting into Thanksgiving, we're getting into the holidays, and, that is totally appropriate as long as the individual feels like they're the one, in control and making those decisions and feels good about it.
That's interesting that texture would make a difference. Texture and color. That seems so like arbitrary. Like to me, I guess like my own experience, I'm not a scientist, but would say like, if you're in a family setting, you're going to be talking to people, hopefully. And that'll slow you down slow down your eating. And maybe that was the effect. Maybe the slower eating, the more intentional, like you're talking about decision making was what caused it. But I never thought about textures and colors being the thing. That's interesting. Yeah,
and I guess it could be somewhat cultural too, right? Like I know that a lot of people, if they grew up in like more of like a, foodie environment or ate out a lot when they were younger, like that need for like crunch, that need for, a broth, that need for, like, how like boba tea has like, the boba's like squishy, like in like Taiwanese culture and a lot of Asian culture, like that texture of like gooey rice ball, vibe is something people like, and so I think when you feel satisfied from different texture, you feel like, good about the meal overall rather than, let's say you have a plate of just, mashed potatoes with no gravy. And then you have like a chicken breast with nothing on it, and you look at your plate and you're like, okay, this is like all light tan. You would kind of notice versus you see someone with a plate of like the rainbow, like eat the rainbow, right? That's something I say to my clients a lot is how do you and that doesn't mean eat more Skittles. You can have Skittles, but in terms of like, the benefit from the color of the food actually makes an impact on its benefit for your health. So, like for example, orange foods like sweet potatoes, the yolk of an egg, that orange color is vitamin A. And so the more orange, you're getting more vitamin A. So that one's really cool. I think that's a good, easy one to remember. And then I think, what else did I say? Oh yeah. So we're getting into color a little bit, right? Like, why do you think, fast food places and candy is colorful? Because there's a component of that that's enticing, right? And so utilizing that when you're making, a salad or making a plate for Thanksgiving or enjoying a meal, how can you add more, diversity in color and texture? When you add diversity in color and texture from whole foods, you're increasing the diversity of the nutrients you're getting, which in turn, benefits your gut health, benefits, your overall health.
Yeah, I've actually been seeing, I'm on like a kind of like weightlifting side of Instagram. And so I see this kind of duality of white rice and no chicken, no seasoning on your chicken is like that not great kind of category. And then there's this really interesting thing that I've seen. I haven't tried it. It's probably good. Where you put ground beef with bananas and honey. Have you seen that mix of like fruit and meat?
No.
That sounds very unusual, doesn't it?
Yeah. I mean, okay. So what, are you cooking the bananas and the honey with the ground beef?
I think you fully cook the ground beef and then you cut up the bananas a little bit. You put it in and then drizzle it with honey.
Interesting. I mean, people dip their bacon in maple syrup, so I don't think it's like terrible.
I guess.
I mean, and then they're getting, their protein and their carbs. So if it works for them, yeah. No, and again, I think with like meal prep, it can like seem really boring because of the whole idea of like chicken breast, rice. Like if there's ways, to make it more interesting, more satisfying by, I believe that adding herbs to everything makes everything better, right? So like taking that extra time to add, some herbs like cilantro or green onion or onion in general, garlic, and then, actually giving yourself the olive oil and the other seasonings and making it actually, number one, taste good, and number one, look like you're getting, a lot of different things. I know that can be like a boundary for people because it's more work. But nowadays we have like, food processors. So
yeah, like I've seen some really interesting looking sauces that people make out of like Greek yogurt and random vegetable things that look really good. And it kind of reminds me of like, I guess how I view fast food, especially fried chicken places. My God. It's like mainly you're not tasting the chicken, you're tasting the sauce. And so the sauce is what makes it enjoyable, which is useful for meal prep because if you make a bunch of different sauces, you can have the same meal and have it taste different every single part of the week if that's what you're into.
Yeah. I'm like big into sauce. So I also am part owner of a restaurant and it's Asian fusion. My family's in the restaurant business. So I actually was one of those kids that grew up in a restaurant, which makes a lot of sense why I like nutrition. But sauce is everything, right? Like you just said, that's a good example. Like you can do chicken and rice in so many different ways. You can do more of like an Asian version. You can do more Italian, but by just changing 2 or 3 things and having like a large jar of that sauce, like, either you made it or, I mean, these days you can go to a pretty good grocery store and find different ones. But sauce, I agree with you, is like the game changer.
Yeah, that's the really important thing to me. And I know that when I'm grocery shopping, I live with my family. I don't want to slam their pantry with a bunch of things I'm going to use once or twice. So what do you recommend for, I guess, things that are commonly used in sauce to make things taste good? Like to different seasoning that you would recommend?
Yeah, so I guess it depends on a couple things, like whether you like spicy food or not, because I love spicy food. Okay. So that's a really common one for me. I think, doing like chili oil is a common one for me. But I really like a really simple one is like a vinaigrette kind of vibe. So like, if you'd like mustard, Dijon mustard, chop up some shallots, a little bit of lemon juice, olive oil, and then put some different things in there like garlic powder, onion powder. That's kind of a lighter version, right? I think a lot of people really like kind of more like a kind of Mexican vibe too. So you could do like, just even a basic already pre-made salsa, right? And then, add, beans to that chicken and rice, and then, maybe some avocado and cilantro, and then it's more pretty or like, fun to look at. And then also fills you up more. And it, overall the flavor is a lot more satisfying.
Yeah. Cause that's something, when I look at those like plain white rice and chicken, there's a part of me that's like, nope, we're not eating that. I'd rather starve than eat something like that. But I love chili flakes, like that chili oil, the laugan ma. Like I love that stuff. is something I've been using recently, and I get. Sorry, you were
Go
about
ahead.
to talk. With the chili oil, what like is that oil from the chili? Is that like healthy?
The oil is not from the chili. So what they do is they take like, oftentimes garlic, like black bean sauce, stuff like that, and the chilies, and then pour oil over it. So, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of talk about like seed oils and, canola oil and some of these things not being good for you. I don't have enough information about whether that's true. And from my perspective, plant-based oils are going to be unsaturated fat, and unsaturated fat is good for our heart. And so things like canola oil, olive oil, things like that are great. In terms of like vegetable oil, palm oil, some people, it just doesn't make them feel good. So that could be a problem. And like, again, with fat, it's, 9 kcals per gram compared to, carbs and protein. It's a lot higher and it's a lot more satiating. So the volume we need is less. But I'm with you. I love that chili oil. I use it on everything. And I think if you tolerate it fine, I think it's totally fine.
Yeah. And I guess for meal prep, I've heard of like crock pot stuff. You can just throw a bunch of random stuff in a pot and it turns out fine. Is that the recommended method, do you think? Or like for a lot of clients, for people that maybe can't afford a personal like consultant, stuff like that, what would you recommend as like their main method of meal planning that would be useful and easy?
Yeah. So I think for most people, coming up with like 2 or 3 breakfasts and that's it, right? I think a lot of times we're so in a hurry in our mornings that we don't need to get fancy and cute with it. And so, I oftentimes start there. Okay, what are 1 or 2 breakfasts that you are willing to have every day? Like whether that's Greek yogurt and berries or, avocado toast with eggs or whatever, ground beef, etc. In terms of like dinner, which is like when we're the most tired and when we want to, put the least amount of work into the kitchen, I would say, that's a good point that you made is Instant Pot, crock pot, rice cooker meals is getting really popular too. And yeah, there's like so many good recipes. I think you can even just take like, again, salsa, chicken breast, and like literally just that and put it in the Instant Pot and, with the pressure cooker, maybe like 45 minutes, maybe longer if you're doing just a crock pot. And that becomes a really easy meal that you can, again, shred and use for that night. But then you can also put it in burritos, put it in tacos, quesadillas, etc. Just like do like a black bean and rice bowl. Having your protein and base and have it be flavorful, like you said, with the sauce is huge. There's a couple other recipes I sent to clients recently that I thought were pretty cool in terms of like Instant Pot, crock pot. Like a lot of us like curries, right? So if you're really into curry, just buying like curry from, Trader Joe's or something and throwing that in with chicken thighs or, a meat of choice is really easy as well. So those are some of the things I would kind of start with if you're, really new into cooking and you want something satisfying but not messy and you're a little, afraid of like whether it's chopping or cooking over the stove or something like that. Doing the crock pot method is definitely recommended.
Okay. I think I have like a couple more questions, but I don't know if you want to speak to this, but there's like, the meal prep programs. Like, do you think they're useful? Like, do you think they're cost effective, stuff like that? Would you recommend them to clients who maybe don't have enough time?
Yeah. So I have recommended a couple to clients in the past. It really depends on how much you can afford and what you're looking for. For like older populations, those can be really helpful because of like lack of mobility and transportation. But most of my clients, I don't have a single client that's on them right now, but they find them a little boring and repetitive. And but for some people, if they find that access to healthy food is not there, they don't have the time to prepare it, they're not working from home, so their access is minimal, that can be really helpful. There's a couple that I like, and I'm totally blanking on the name. That's obviously how much I don't really interact with them. But I I think that they can be a really good option. I also think that, like, for example, when I was in grad school, I would just go to Trader Joe's and buy like their pre-made salads. You know, they have the hot and cold section, you know, frozen foods. Like, there are options, right? It's just knowing how to navigate those options that I think becomes tricky when we're trying to, like, again, you know, hit all of those goals in terms of macronutrients. But, you know, packaged food is not, you know, the enemy. And it definitely is a really helpful tool, like especially lunch, you know. So whether it's Trader Joe's or some other store, having at least a couple backups, either in your freezer or your fridge, is really nice. And also, you know, when you're getting started on meal planning and trying to incorporate, you know, more balance in your diet, you know, starting small, right? Okay, I'm going to cook one big crock pot meal this week, and then I'm going to see how long those leftovers last me. And then, you know, work yourself up and see what you like, what you don't like, rather than kind of feeling like, okay, I don't know what I'm getting myself into, but I'm going to meal prep and eat the same thing 5 days in a row, same meal 3 days a week, 3 meals a day. So that would be my recommendation is, you know, start small and have some guidance, because I think accountability becomes the trickiest part with all this.
I saw that with your consulting. You offer you have different payment plans. And one of them you offer the grocery, like you can walk them through a grocery store kind of like, I guess, virtually.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then like show them what they can buy and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. So I do the grocery store tours in person if they're local. Okay. I haven't done like a virtual one, but I actually, what's interesting is I haven't had that many clients, you know, want to do it, but the ones that have loved it, because a lot of times, you know, when we have sessions and they're like, I'm like, oh yeah, do you have a question? And they're like, no. But then when you're in the grocery store, when you're actively engaging with food and products, the questions like start flowing, you know? Mm-hmm. And I think it's also really helpful because it's like, you know, an opportunity for me to, you know, be engaging with the client, or there's a lot of tips and tricks too around how to navigate a grocery store. Like, for example, all the fresh stuff is going to be on the perimeter. And so doing that lap first and then going into the other things you need, you know, coming in with a plan, not going super hungry. That's like a really hard one, right? Yeah. I know that one's one of the hardest, but it's sometimes the most fun when you're hungry.
Yeah, because I know that I guess, going back to the willpower question I brought up earlier, for me, it's way easier to say no in a grocery store when I'm running around shopping for my family than it is to have it in my house. Mm-hmm. So for me, at least, it's more useful to just leave it in the store rather than get it and then put it in my pantry and then try to forget about it, you know?
Yeah, and everyone kind of has to figure out what works best for them, right? Like, for some people, you know, having too many like snacks and sweets and things is too tempting. And so they'd rather it be like a treat that they go out of the house for example. And that works for them. That's great. For some people, they find that when they don't have those things in the house, it almost creates a more challenging relationship with that food. And so when they do have it around, or they're at another friend's house, or they're in another environment, then they kind of overdo it. And so I come at both of those types of behaviors with clients and say, okay, it's okay to have something sweet after dinner every night if you want, you know, but does that feel comfortable for you? And let's try it and see if that starts to like break some of the previous thoughts or connotations they had with that food. And if for some people, they're like, no, if I eat a piece of chocolate like at lunch, then I'm just thinking about the next piece of chocolate, you know, all day. And that's not sustainable for me. So it can work both ways. So maybe for you, it sounds like, you know, having maybe a snack or two around is good, but preferring to keep a lot of it out of the house.
Yeah, generally.
Yeah.
That's something I appreciate about consulting services, because you have a ton of people online giving very, very general prescriptions for things that are not really that general. And a lot of it's mental health included, right? Eating disorders and stuff. So that's why I appreciate like one-on-one conversations, because like then you can actually get to know the person and say, like, the solution for me might cause disordered eating in a different person. That is a huge consequence.
Totally. And a lot of times, you know, for some people it is just like the basic knowledge around nutrition people don't know, but most of the time it's the behaviors around diet and food, and that is very personalized, like you just said. So yeah, that one-on-one time is really valuable, and it's definitely a big transition for me because I used to work inpatient at the hospital. I used to be a researcher, and I've, started my private practice in the last, year or two, and it's really built up. And I kind of decided, I'm not going to specialize in one thing right away. I just cast my net out, really wide and see, what people are going through. And so that's what this year has been for me, is really just seeing what people are going through. How can I learn a little bit more about how behavior and asking the right questions plays a role in their success.
Okay. So I guess wrapping up the discussion, let's go by category. So regarding supplements, what are I guess, can you name us the supplements you were talking about before?
Mm-hmm. So the top 3 supplements I recommend for athletes or individuals who are physically active or wanting to get a little bit of an edge are creatine monohydrate, caffeine, if caffeine is something that, you can tolerate, and nitrate. So nitrate, again, that can come from foods, but also there are a lot of supplements out there. They should be coming from beetroot juice, celery, or spinach extract. So that's what you're going to see it either in a powder or in a juice form. Those would be my main ones. And again, my biggest recommendation with that is be cautious of third-party testing and avoid a lot of these supplements or pre-workouts or things that say they have 30 ingredients in them. Because number one, are you getting the effective dose that's recommended? Probably not. And are they just trying to make you spend more money by adding in all of these other things that we don't actually know have as much of a benefit?
Okay. And then I guess with nutrition, I won't put a number on it. You can say have as many key takeaways as you want. So.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Oh man, that's hard.
It's a big question. I'm sorry.
So I would say number one with nutrition, the world tries to make it very complicated. Marketing and food companies intentionally make it hard to navigate. So learning more about, that intention can be helpful in feeling like you are in control of your choices. And then I would say, my next tip is the answer to a healthy eating and, maybe weight loss, if that's your goal, or weight gain, healthy weight gain, is whole foods, mostly plants, but also incorporating, quality sources of protein, whether that's animals or plants. So again, fruits, vegetables. And it's so hard because it's such we hear that all the time, right? Mm-hmm. They're like, eat fruits, eat vegetables. But finding ways in which you actually enjoy those foods is a really important part as well. That's my number 2. Let me think. Number 3, don't forget why you enjoy food for other reasons other than performance benefits. Food is social, food is cultural. As we get into the holidays, when you travel, it's a really great way to get to know somebody. And so it's an experience. So never forget that. And I think it can also help take away some of the negative feelings we have about ourselves and our relationship with food.
I really like that last one, especially with Thanksgiving coming up.
Yeah. Yeah. Enjoy yourself. That's the point. The year happens and our lives happen in seasons. There's going to be times where we may, emotionally eat. There's going to be times where we're a little bit more on our regimen, and that's okay as long as the steady long-term trajectory feels obtainable, consistent, and it feels good.
Cool. Yeah, I guess that's it. With the sources, we'll link them all in the description that you talked about.
Definitely.
And thank you for coming on.
Yeah, thank you so much, Eric. It was lovely being on.